We're here at the Defence24 days here in Warsaw at the National Stadium, and joining me now is Keir Giles, a senior consulting fellow for the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House, also author of the book, Who Will Defend Europe? Keir, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Now let's go ahead and start off with your book, Who Will Defend Europe? We spoke earlier, you told me you authored this book last year. We've had some significant developments over the last 100 days.
It's true there have been significant developments, but most of them were fairly predictable, and that's why I was able to write a book this time last year about the situation we have today. Because despite what Trump is doing domestically in the United States, the overspill and the effect on Europe was pretty much foreseeable. Because we've still got three basic elements of the problem that have remained unchanged. There's Russian determination to pose a threat to the continent. There's American disengagement, which was foreseeable because this is not a Trump problem. This is a long-term systemic change in U.S. attitudes. And then there's Western European denialism. And that's part of a problem that I describe in the book using the phrase west of Warsaw. That phrase crops up a lot, and it describes those countries in the European hinterland that still are not facing up to the scale and the immediacy of the challenge, unlike, for example, Poland, where we are today.
Well, Poland seems to be a poster child, right, for defense spending, but still to do the capability catch-up and, well, for Europe to become self-sufficient and create the deterrence that is needed to fend off Russia and have the United States have a lesser role here on the continent. Do you think Europe is up for this challenge?
That's a really good question, and it's something which changes day to day. Now, in the book, I pointed to two examples of how you can rise to the challenge. Not just Poland in terms of crash rearmament, making itself a greater deterrent power and being ready for if deterrence fails, but also singling out Finland as covering the other side of making yourself a hard target, making society resilient, making sure that if Russia tries to stop societal functions happening, or the economy functioning, then the country is actually able to withstand that and recover from it. But those are two examples just showing that it can be done. It also needs the will from other European governments to actually go ahead and do it. And that's where we're still, even after this rapid pace of change and it being rammed home how immediate the problem is, we're not seeing the pace of action that we need from Western European capitals to try to emulate what countries like Poland and Finland are doing.
Well, and why exactly do you think that is? It will definitely sow discontent in societies when immediately you boost spending from less than 2% to 5% of GDP. Well, there's a lot of programs that you won't be able to spend money on for your societies. Do you think that that's one of the main factors that dictates what politicians do and how they plan things out? It's
certainly one of the main factors, the fact that the challenge and the threat has not been successfully explained to Western European publics. Now, nobody can boost from 2% of GDP to 5% overnight. That has to be a gradual process, not only because of the financial challenges involved, but also because of the challenges of actually spending that amount of money. But a much better way of measuring just what needs to be done to be defense relevant in today's world is actually looking not at the input, not at the percentage of GDP that's spent, but at the output, what it actually buys. And one of the things that's been overlooked in these defense conversations is that there are templates for what Europe needs, with or without the United States, for deterring Russia and ensuring that the war does not spread beyond Ukraine in the form of NATO plans. NATO member states have committed resources to NATO plans. It's just in some cases, what those NATO states actually have is far less than what they've actually promised to NATO. That's a far better measure of what needs to be done in terms of change to be ready for defense.
In terms of deterrence that Europe currently possesses, let's take away the United States. Does Europe possess sufficient deterrence to deter Russian aggression?
That's one of the unknowns, partly because the answer to that question lies in the minds of planners in the Kremlin, but also because what we haven't seen publicly, at least, is that process of military inventorization to determine just what is exactly feasible if the United States is either not involved or possibly actively opposed. And there's a suspicion that that might lie behind some of the policy twists and turns that we've seen, particularly in this conversation about the so-called coalition of the willing, trying to impose themselves into Ukraine to make sure that any peace agreement that is reached is sustainable. We've heard repeatedly that this cannot be done without the United States, even though the United States has clearly signaled that it's not interested. And that, of course, leads to the suspicion that there has been a conclusion that this isn't possible without U.S. cooperation.
But isn't it just back down to political will again? Mentioning the coalition of the willing, now we hear that it's difficult to muster 25,000 troops. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said it really beautifully. Why are 500 million Europeans asking 320 million Americans to defend them against 140 million Russians? Excuse me. Is that the type of mentality that needs to be taken in capitals across the continent?
The mentality is the first step, but then there's also, after the mindset change, there's also the practical means of doing something about it. Because what European countries are confronting now is the consequence of 30 years of defense drawdown. That can't be fixed overnight. But it has also led to an assumption, a default assumption among some major Western European militaries that they will only ever go to war as part of a coalition, and the founding member of that coalition and the backbone of it is going to be the United States. Now, if that's no longer true, that forces a complete rethink of defense posture, of armed forces structuring, of doctrine, of strategy. All of these things need to change if there's a new strategic reality that Europe is going to operate in. And if in the meantime the conclusion is that no, European militaries on this vastly wealthy continent aren't actually capable of projecting power in their own neighborhood and being somewhere if Russia doesn't want them to be there, then that begs the question, what exactly are these European armed forces for if they cannot carry out these prime political missions?
We've seen the European Union announce, 800 billion euro till the end of the decade, through the auspices of the European Council, Ursula von der Leyen's plan. Is that enough to close the gap in capabilities to create that sufficient enough deterrence to deter Russia by the end of the decade, in your opinion? Or
it's really important to be clear on what exactly has been announced, because we hear a lot of fantasy numbers. In some cases, they are just the European Union creating the fiscal conditions in which countries can spend if they want to, as opposed to new money suddenly being magicked out of thin air to spend on things. But then it's down to the individual countries, whether individually or working together, to actually find the ways in which they can best use those funds and where the money is going to come from still. Coming back to your earlier point, what has to give in order for defense to be treated as a priority? For a long time, we've heard from countries like the UK, from France, that there isn't any money for defense. Well, that's not quite true. There's plenty of money. It's just being spent on other things. But it comes back to that fundamental mission of European politicians of communicating clearly to their populations that if defense is not treated as a priority, all those other things may become irrelevant.
And how vulnerable is this long-term strategic planning on the continent? Amongst all these sovereign states, how vulnerable is that to domestic elections, which take place ever so often, and perhaps a new format of alliance is needed?
Well, always in organizations like the EU or like NATO, because they are based on consensus, you're going to have the lowest common denominator of what is actually possible. And that is the reason why, instead of any of these pre-existing organizations being activated now to meet political challenges, you have to have conversations about a new organization, coalitions of the least unwilling, the ones that actually recognize the problem and are willing to do something about it. And that talks to the deficiencies in the previous structures that were set up for European defense if they are challenged by that core member, the United States, suddenly signaling less interest in meeting their alliance commitments.
Your outlook for this whole process, will Europe rise to the challenge?
Sadly, there are no signs of it yet. There is a lot being said, but far less being done. And of course, again, we have to remember that this is not the whole of Europe. The frontline states, the ones that are first in line to the challenge, they understand what is needed and they're doing something about it. It's time now for Western Europe to follow their example and recognize that if there is a challenge to Europe as a whole, they are not going to be isolated, they're not going to be immune because of distance.
Certainly. Well, Keir Giles, the Senior Consulting Fellow for the Russia and Eurasia Programme, as well as author of Who Will Defend Europe. Thank you very much for joining us on TVP World. And that does it for us here from the Defense 24 days. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.